So today I want to talk a little bit about educating your clients around CBT. One of the characteristics of cognitive behavioral therapy is that it has a strong teaching component. We're teaching clients skills that will help them during the session, between sessions, and for the remainder of their lives. So the skills that they learn in therapy are hopefully skills that they can transfer into a variety of situations or difficulties that they have down the road. So we put a strong emphasis on teaching within cognitive therapy. So one of the very sort of simplest ways to start off by teaching clients about the cognitive flow and the relationship between mood, interpretation, and event is just to use a simple flow diagram. So we can start off by saying to a client, you have sort of a situation that happens for you, and that leads you to have a certain kind of feeling. So someone says something to you that's critical, and you feel hurt or upset by that. But one of the things that we want to look at cognitive therapy is what happens between the event and the feeling that you have as a result of that situation. And in cognitive therapy, we look at how you interpret So from a cognitive perspective, we look at how do we interpret the event that leads to the feeling. Because we can have two clients in exactly the same situation and make very different interpretations of that situation. A good example of this is to consider when you're walking down the street and you wave at somebody and then they don't wave back. How do you feel when that happens? You might feel hurt because they didn't respond to you. You might think to yourself, oh, they didn't notice me, and you don't have much of an emotional reaction. Maybe you feel angry because you're interpreting the situation as they're snubbing you. So depending at how you interpret the event, that has a lot to do with how you feel after the event happens. And so we can explain cognitive therapy and the principle of cognitive therapy through this flow chart. Fairly simple. You can write it up on a whiteboard or write it on a piece of paper and give it to the client. In one of the video clips that we watched for this course with Amy Wenzel, she draws a very similar diagram, except she draws it vertically. One of the reasons I like to draw it horizontally is I also start to tie it into the treatment plan. So from a treatment perspective, we can target one of these three different areas with the client. So obviously we can work on the interpretation and ask Socratic questions about how accurately are they interpreting the situation. Is there an alternative way to interpret it? We can also go after the event itself, and perhaps we want to engage the client in some problem solving around a difficult event that's happened for them. Maybe they've lost their job. How do they problem solve with that? Or maybe some skills development, maybe some social skills to help with social anxiety or assertiveness training if they have issues with anger or difficulty speaking up for themselves. We can also sort of target the feeling that people have through things like relaxation exercises or mindfulness, things that they can do to be more accepting of the emotions that they are experiencing. So this makes a nice kind of flow chart. Sometimes another way to go is get into a little bit of the neurobiology of depression and how that works in the brain. Some clients are more interested in this than others, and you want to kind of make some judgments about that. But one thing that you can do is kind of draw a picture of the brain. Not the world's best example of it. And those of you who have taken the course in mental health and read some of Ed Taylor's book on kind of the neurobiology of depression know that you have a couple of structures in the brain. One is the neurocortex at the front of the brain that has sort of a moderating approach to emotions in the brain. And it kind of is executive functioning, and it kind of information kind of goes through it before the brain decides what to do. You have a more emotional part of the brain, which is an older part of the brain, tied more to sort of animal instincts, that is highly reactive to situations and creates that sort of fight or flight response. So the amygdala is very much in charge of emotions, or kind of the triggering point where emotions come from. One of the things that's happening in depression, or what normally is happening for individuals, is that the frontal cortex is regulating the amygdala. So it keeps the amygdala from being overreactive or underreactive. It helps the brain interpret the environment, make sense of it, and tells the amygdala when to get excited and when to stay calm. I like to use kind of an analogy of your thermostat and your furnace. So the frontal cortex is like the thermostat in your house, and the amygdala is like the furnace. And when the temperature in your house gets cold, the furnace turns on. The thermostat says, the house is cold, let's turn on the furnace. When your house reaches the temperature that you've set the thermostat for, it then shuts down the furnace. And so the furnace is regulated by the thermostat. In the same way, the amygdala is regulated by the frontal cortex. And so the frontal cortex interpretation of the world around you determines how excited your amygdala gets. Now, individuals with depression and a variety of mental health issues, this communication system seems to be breaking down. And so the connection between the two isn't working anymore. And so what is happening is the amygdala starts to run the show. And so what we see in depressed people is either they're very emotional, they cry easily, there's high expression of emotion, or conversely, we see them kind of emotionally blunted without a lot of sort of emotional reaction to situations, and they're kind of emotionally flat. And that's because the amygdala basically doesn't know what to do. It's reacting to environmental situations without the benefit of the frontal cortex telling it how to respond. Now, in treatment of depression, one of the main treatments is, of course, medication. And the medications focus on serotonin often, which is basically helping this communication system work better. So when we give people antidepressant communication, it's improving the communication between the frontal cortex and the amygdala. Now, in cognitive therapy, we're using a non-medication approach to basically do the same thing. We're getting the client to activate their frontal cortex, to think about how they're interpreting situations. And so we're manually getting this part of the brain working so that it can regulate the emotional response of the brain. So sometimes if you draw that diagram for a client, that provides sort of useful information. So if we can help the frontal cortex think more clearly about the situations that they're in, then they will have less difficulty with their emotional response to the brain. Some other ways to go about doing education with clients, simple reading. If you look at the Mind Over Mood book, there's a number of chapters in there that might be useful for a client to read. Helps them kind of understand how cognitive therapy works. Another simple one that we sometimes use in group situations is to take a piece of paper, crumple it up, and then we kind of throw it to a client. And usually a client reaches out and can catch it. And so you ask them the question, well, how did you catch that? And they go, well, I just caught it. And then you ask them, well, did you have to think about it? Did you have to sort of calculate the trajectory? Did you have to do a bunch of math calculations? And they say, no, I just did it automatically. And that's a good way to look at automatic thoughts. They just pop into your head. You just do them because you've been doing them for so many years. So just like a person catching a crumpled piece of paper. Sometimes you can, if you don't want to use a crumpled piece of paper, you can kind of just use a bit of a rubber ball, right? Now, one I ran across lately, and it's kind of a fun one if you're a bit of a practical joker, is to take an egg and then you throw it at a client to catch it. Now, these eggs are trick eggs. They're actually rubber balls, and so you can kind of bounce them And so you kind of have a twofold here. One is how did you catch it kind of discussion, but also what was your interpretation of what was coming at you. You saw an egg, you thought it was an egg, you interpreted the possibility of the egg cracking. And so anyways, those are cheap from the dollar store if you want to kind of do that. Other things to think about in terms of education or just personal stories. So this is a good place for self-disclosure. Did you go through a situation where you were struggling with an event? And did you have a way of coming to a different interpretation of that event that helped you get through a difficult time? So that can sometimes be a useful place for it. I find it really useful to bring in current events. I think it keeps your therapy a little bit more alive if you're paying attention to the world around you yourself and looking at events that are happening in the world out there and bring them into your therapy session. So often you will have news events about individuals that have gone through a very difficult time. And if you listen to their story, you'll see how they got through by making a shift in terms of how they interpreted the situation. And so I've put a couple of examples of that in the itinerary if you want to look at that. Sporting events are great with that. Athletes who have struggled with sort of the mental side of their sport will often talk about a mental shift that they've made that's led to success. Sometimes there's sort of interesting metaphors. There's a fellow by the name of Daniel Amen who does sort of public speaking about cognitive therapy in kind of a popular kind of way. And he takes the phrase automatic negative thoughts and uses it as an acronym for ANTS. And he will talk about you don't want to have ants in your head. You don't want to have these automatic negative thoughts. And so he talks about ways of reinterpreting events around them. And so, with the right kind of person, that sort of ant metaphor may be helpful. I've seen other writers who use metaphors around like a computer, that your brain is like a computer, and cognitive therapy is your antivirus. So we're trying to take that negative interpretation that you have in your brain and come up with a more realistic, positive interpretation of the situation. So those are just a few thoughts that I have about how you can go about providing education to clients around sort of the basics of sort of the cognitive principle. And I think you'll find those to be useful. So good luck with that.